I'm pleased to introduce Tim from telegeography. Thank you.
Thanks. Now for something completely different. Optical illusions. There's something powerful about illusions that have always drawn us to them, I think. Today, we might satisfy our love of illusions by going to the movie theater to see the latest big-budget special effects film. Perhaps you'll wear 3D glasses to make the illusion even stronger. But in the past, you may have bought tickets to the circus or going to see the traveling freak show. Or before that, going to try to catch a glimpse of the court magicians. In all those cases, there's one thing in common in that the audience was sort of in on the trick. They knew there was sleight of hand going on, and part of the fun is trying to figure out how the illusion is being performed. I would argue that a most powerful kind of illusion, though, is the kind that creeps up on us unaware. Those are the kinds of illusions that can possibly lead us astray and cause damage even. That may be, to a certain extent, the case of what's going on in the international transport markets. At the center of the confusion are content providers. And for the rest of the talk, when I'm talking about content providers, I'm talking about the few really big ones, such as Google, Facebook, Microsoft, maybe cloud providers such as Amazon, that have really large bandwidth requirements. So for the next half hour, I'd like to divide it into have three different elements that I'd like to discuss to talk about how these possible costs and benefits of content providers' participation in transport is potentially illusory. First of all, I'd like to talk about how the demand for bandwidth from content providers are changing supply that we're seeing in international transport markets. Secondly, I'd like to talk about how that demand is shifting prices that we all have to pay for transport. And finally, because we'll be discussing some of the fact that content is somehow shrouded in mystery within the transport markets, I thought it would be appropriate to amaze and entertain you with some actual optical illusions. So that will be our third element. The only thing that I ask for the remainder of the talk is that you keep in mind that what I'm about to show you is not a trick, it's an illusion. Also, if you're, during any illusions, if the song Final Countdown pops into your head, just to keep it, it's part of your ongoing internal monologue and not hum it out loud. First thing we want to talk about is how much international transport is really dependent on content provider growth. And that brings us to our very first optical illusion. And that is that sometimes we require motion to fully appreciate an image. In explaining how illusions work, a lot of people rely on or borrow a concept from psychology called Gestalt. I really like that word, and I want to use it if I'm ever invited to one of those fancy cocktail receptions where everyone is swirling snifters of brandy because it sounds really sophisticated. But all it really means, a Gestalt, is when the organized whole is perceived as greater than the sum of the parts of an image. Here I'm showing you 4 points of light, but I suspect that you can't grasp the Gestalt of this image yet. Partly it's because I'm cheating. I'm only showing you the lower third. So let's add 5 more points. Do you see what it is now? Probably not. How about now? This is all the points I have. I asked my older son what he thought this was, and he thought it was a mountain. I asked my wife what it was, and she thought it might be 2 hands folded in prayer. And I asked my younger son what it was, and he told me he wanted to watch Puppy Dog Pals because he's 3, and that's what he does. But we really need to put this in motion to get a sense of the Gestalt. Let's see if we can do that here. Now do you see the image? Now is it fixed in your mind? You have the Gestalt. It's obviously a person walking, and this is particularly powerful for us as humans or as animals because there's a segment of our brain that's predisposed to grasping biological motion. Tests have proven that other animals and even infants as young as 2 can grasp these point light displays. But really, it's motion. That's powerful. Now, if I fix this image, you can still hold it in your mind. You can see now that it's a person. You don't see a mountain or hands folded in prayer. It's a person, obviously. But that's because we had the motion. The same holds true for the international transport markets. We needed to see some motion to really appreciate what's going on in order to recognize the new gestalt in the industry. This graphic is displaying the makeup of international bandwidth demand over time. What I'm showing you right now is from 2002 to 2012. The very tiny segment at the top that's brown was the PSTN, switched voice. As late as 1998, that would have accounted for fully half of all international bandwidth demand, but that very rapidly changed in the run-up to where this image starts in 2002. Also fairly small and fairly static over time is the yellow segment, which are private networks operated by content providers. Telegeography, in fact, wasn't able to identify any international private networks run by content providers until 2004. To the extent those companies even existed back then, they would have pushed around their relatively meager bits through either IP transit or peering. And up through 2012, it was still fairly small. So through the period of this time, for a full decade, it was dominated in a very static way by traditional public internet. That's how most demand for international transport came about. But let's set this in motion and let's look at what's happened in just the last few years. Really astonishing movement. This is in aggregate the entire world international bandwidth demand, and you can see over a third now of international transport is being used by just a handful of content providers. I'm going to show you later on in the presentation on a few routes, they're even larger, much larger, a majority. But even so, on this aggregate view, it's pretty astonishing. Now, that's a historical view. Let's take a forward-looking view and draw this out to see what might happen in the future. There's a lot going on in this particular image, so let me break it down. There are three major elements I want to draw your attention to. First, the small blue element at the bottom. That's everyone besides content providers, how much bandwidth requirement they will need. Telegeography estimates across the Atlantic. I just picked the Atlantic as an example here. The green is content providers. Again, just a few companies. We're projecting this out by assuming that over the next few years, their growth will continue apace relative to what we've experienced in the past few years, and then it will gradually decelerate. But even with that deceleration, the growth is astonishing. In aggregate, we're talking about 54% compounded annual growth for the next 7 years. Where things get really weird, though, is comparing it to the third element, which is that red line. That's the capacity, the potential capacity of all existing submarine cables that are in the water now, including the Maria cable, which has been laid, but I don't believe it'll be active until early next year. That is if all those cables were made as efficient as possible, their inventories were cleared up, and had the latest SLT attached to them, fully lit. What do you see here? Well, the blue and the green bandwidth requirements will exceed potential capacity on all cables by 2020 or so. That's crazy. Not only that, but bandwidth will be growing so fast, demand will be growing so fast by the end of this forecast period that we will need 1 to 2 new cables each year fully lit just to keep up with demand. But there's a scary element to this. A couple of things, actually. One is that we're talking about just a few companies that are driving a lot of this growth. And secondly, we don't really have good visibility into their long-term bandwidth requirements. Talking to some of the submarine cable network planners in these companies, I don't think they do either. So it's a little bit dangerous to depend on those companies' growth long-term. So what would happen if we assume that after a couple of years, their bandwidth demand growth would transition to what everyone else in the market is experiencing? Well, the supply-demand interchange is much different. We will need new cables in the future, but much further out. So with all this new demand, you probably are thinking it would make sense that a lot of these content providers, since there are just a few of them, will start building cables, or at least participating in new builds. And you'd be right, to a certain degree. And that brings us to our second illusion. The first one held that sometimes we need motion to fully appreciate an image. This is somewhat the opposite. Sometimes we see motion that doesn't actually exist. Now, I haven't tested this on the big screen, so I'm not sure if this is going to work for you, but we'll see. I can't really even see from this angle. When you look at it, do you see motion if you move your eyes around? The effect probably is going to be more powerful even if once you download the PDF and look at it more up close. There's something called asymmetric luminance at play that triggers our motion detectors. I have no idea what that means, but I think it's kind of cool, and it sort of fits in with the rest of the presentation. So how are we perceiving motion in the market that doesn't exist? Well, to a certain extent, there is motion with content providers. They are participating in new builds. Here's a list of some of the publicly disclosed cables in which content providers have either direct ownership or fiber pair purchases or major spectrum. And if it looks like over time they're participating in more and more, you'd be right. They are. There is an accelerating trend here at play. But let's not get too carried away. I set the top of the y-axis here at $500 million, but let's put it in perspective to what people are actually spending to build new cables, around $5 billion a year. Yellow is what everyone else is putting into the market. Now, I'm not talking about upgrades capital spend. Their content providers are leading the way. But in terms of building new cables, it's kind of like the old way of doing it. Carriers and ISPs are still putting in a lot, and third parties are borrowing from financial institutions, and private equity is still being involved. So we're not yet seeing content providers building a lot of their own cables. In fact, we're not seeing that at all. I would argue that this is potentially a lagging indicator of what's going to happen in the future, but to date, content providers haven't taken over the world with their cables. Part of the reason for that is simple. It has to do with geography, and that is the need for content provider cables are not geographically ubiquitous. So our third optical illusion. Whereas before, sometimes we see motion that doesn't exist, sometimes we perceive color that doesn't exist. So in this image, I see 4 colors. I don't know about you, but I see purple and orange borders. I see a white background and that same white on the 4 vertical rectangles. But on the large horizontal rectangle, I see a beige color or off-white. Do you see that as well? Is that working for you? The beige doesn't exist. It's actually white. This was an optical illusion that was first written about in the late 1980s by some Italian researchers. They called it the watercolor effect. Pretty strange. So applying this to international transport, in terms of colors, I've colored the content provider segment on various routes yellow, and you can see in the Atlantic a huge amount of capacity, and this is of 2016, it's even greater in 2017, of Atlantic demand was used by content providers. But a lot of potential cable operators out there on other routes are applying these lessons and essentially seeing this yellow color on their routes when it's not existing. This is what other routes in the world look like. The US Latin America route lags well behind Atlantic and Pacific. That's changing rapidly now. But for capacity connecting Europe to the Middle East, to East Asia, certainly to Africa, we're really not seeing much content provider purchases for transport, and certainly nothing in terms of direct participation in new cables. Another way of looking at this is a map. This is showing all existing cables, planned cables, and hoped for cables that will never happen, but it's essentially everything. These are the ones where content providers have actually been involved in new ones. You can see it's a different story entirely, and it's concentrated on just a few routes. Why is that? I think this map helps explain it. Each dot shows a major data center of one of the larger content providers or cloud providers. And I'm not talking here about the little edge caches meant to populate and serve end users and connect to ISPs. I'm talking about the really big things where storage and compute happens. And it's largely concentrated in the United States, Europe, especially Northern Europe, East Asia, and Singapore. And so it would make sense that the content providers would take a traditional hub and spoke approach to connect their own data centers, with the United States as the global hub. They have a lot of capacity, fiber that they've purchased from old cables and are participating in new builds across the Atlantic. They're building, or they have fiber across the United States, across the Pacific, and down to Singapore. But nothing really yet down to Africa or directly connecting Europe to Asia. And certainly nothing directly connecting, say, China to Chile, which is one of the submarine cable concepts out there. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to laugh. So that's how demand is shaping supply. What about prices? Well, demand is having an effect on prices, but not necessarily in the way you might think. And that brings us to our fourth optical illusion. Sometimes our brain disregards established patterns. Now, before I even show you the next image, I'm going to explain what you should try to keep in your head and what it's going to be. It's an image of a mask, of a face. The mask is, like all masks, concave. The inside, you'll be able to see it, the negative of the person's face, but it's concave, so keep that in mind as it rotates around. Let's see if this works for you. Okay? Yeah, it's freaky, man. So what's going on here? Did a face suddenly extrude out for you and it seems to pop out and then goes back in? Our brain knows that this image is supposed to be concave, but there are two elements at play. One is that this is a two-dimensional representation of a 3D object. And anytime that happens, our brain has to interpolate data to try to interpret what's going on. And the second thing is because this is a face, there's that element of our brain that gauges biological motion that was so powerful we talked about earlier on, also comes into play with face recognition. So even though our brain wants to say that this is a concave object, the portion of our brain that says this is a face overrules that just for a few seconds. Now, in case you think this is a trick, that this is done by this video image, I actually have here a video of an actual mask. This is a cheap-looking Charlie Chaplin mask, plastic mask, and it's concave as well. Keep watching. All right. So sometimes, even though we know something, our brain is prejudiced in a certain way. We're predisposed to a certain viewpoint, and it's hard to overcome that view. What if I told you that demand is going up? What do you think is happening to prices? Prices go up too, right? I mean, everyone knows that, right? Maybe it's been a while since you've taken an economics course. Maybe don't remember why. But what if I told you that what we found in bandwidth markets, that generally faster demand growth leads to faster price declines? It doesn't seem right, does it? It seems wrong. Well, there's a simple way to explain this particular magic. I have a hypothetical cost model for a new cable, or old cable builds, actually. This is all pretty boring. For the sake of time, I'm going to go through it really quickly. Essentially, I just wanted to show my work so I get full credit on the exam. You can go look at it later, but the one key to observe is the final point, is that I'm going to be assuming each year that there's demand growth. In this case, 35% demand growth. All right, so what does it cost to operate a cable? Given the parameters I had just set up, it's going to cost around $850,000 per month. And that will allow you to supply 600 10G waves to the market. That will give you a unit cost of around $1,400 per 10G wave. That's year one. Next year, you're going to enjoy 35% growth in your demand, so you'll be able to provide 810 circuits, 10G circuits or wavelengths to the market. Now, your costs are going to go up a little bit because of upgrade costs. You're going to have to pay for the upgrades, but it's going to be dispersed through a greater number of wavelengths. So look what happens to your unit costs. thanks to a 35% increase in demand, your unit costs have now gone down 23%. If you're in a competitive market, that probably means your prices are going to go down too. So let me illustrate this. Essentially, this part of the presentation is it's a good half of what Dave Schaefer was talking about just yesterday, but with visual aids. What we just talked about, the price is falling from $1,400 to $1,100. That's that tick down in the blue line. But let's say that you're capacity constrained. You have an old cable, such as TAP14 or AC1 across the Atlantic. Classics. You're going to be maxed out in this example at 10 terabits per second. That's not good going forward. Your unit costs are not going to fall because you're not going to have any other future sales to distribute those costs. What happens if you have a 20 terabit per second system? Well, your unit cost is much better long term. So you'll be competitive further down the road. What about 30, 60, 160? 160 terabit systems are currently what's believed possible for the latest and greatest cables, AE Connect and Maria, more or less. Those are going to be competitive in terms of unit cost much longer down the road. All right, that's cost. What about price? Well, across the Atlantic, I plotted out at the end of last year what the weighted average price, if you present it as a 10G wave, was around $2,000. Now, if you're actually buying a 10G wave, it was costlier than that, but a lot of people are buying 100G waves, which are a little bit lower. So that's your average. All right, what happens if we're going to allow that to decrease 20% each year? This is what happens. Pretty crazy. A couple of things that immediately jump out, at least to me. One is that 10 terabit system is kind of screwed. It's going to be more expensive to maintain that cable than it would be to buy that capacity on the open market, even if you're a current owner. So I think we're going to see some decommissioned cables in the coming few years, potentially. And secondly, look even at that really hyper-efficient 160 terabit system. Price is going to approach cost on that system if the prices continue to fall at 20% by the end of the next decade. Doesn't mean that it'll actually fall to that level, but what it probably does mean is that while we're accustomed over the last 20 years to experiencing double-digit price declines for bandwidth, that may not happen forever. The last point I want to talk about is the cable funding dilemma. We've seen that prices are beginning to approach cost on certain routes, and that's a real problem for companies that are trying to raise money to build new cables. Content providers provide a solution to that problem, but to a certain extent, they bring problems of their own. Our fifth illusion that has to do with this, essentially it's the old can't see the forest for the trees. Sometimes the closer we are to an object, the less we see. No, I really like this illusion because it's finally a moment where us people who are, nearsighted get an advantage over everyone else. Two faces here. The person on the left is an angry guy. Looks sort of like Wolfman to me. Person on the right is a man or a woman who's very calm. But what if I were to tell you that you can move the man from the left over to the right and the person from the right over to the left? If you're wearing glasses, all you have to do is take off your glasses. Does that work for you, four-eyed people? Okay. I take pity on people here who have 20/20 vision. So what I've done is taken this image and blurred it out. This is what people with glasses, this is how we perceive the rest of the world. Now watch what happens to the individuals. They're going to switch. You see that? Wolfman's on the right, calm is on the left. This is the original. This is the blurred image. What's happening here is that the people who created this image were very creative and clever. They actually stacked two sets of faces on top of each other. There's a high-resolution image that we're seeing now, but we're also seeing a low-resolution image with this other person superimposed. But our brain is prejudiced here. We only want to focus on the high-res version, and we throw out the information that the image is actually showing us of the other person. All right, here's some more boring stuff. You can go back to it if you want to. What this is showing is a new cable build. Let me get to the good stuff. This is an image of what might happen with a new cable. Let's say you have 6 fiber pair system. It's ready for service date is 2020. What's going to happen? Well, in the 3 years leading up to RFS, you're going to be paying a lot of money out. You're paying for marine survey, fiber manufacture, permitting, the cable lay itself, big CapEx spend. And once the cable goes into service, you have OpEx. Most of that, or a good chunk of that, is operations and maintenance of the cable, and also paying your CEO and salespeople who are hot shots and whatever. The good news is once you reach RFS is you have income. So that's the green element. Now, if you look at it and you try to stack it up in your brain, you might come to worry that even if you add up all the green over time, by 2030 it may not be higher than the blue and yellow costs stacked up. And you, my friend, would be right. This is in our example what happens to the cash flow over time. Huge negative cash in the first 3 years. That's nothing to worry about. That's normal. You have to spend money to make money. But you're not going to be making enough money by the end of this period. Even after 10 years of service, you haven't broken even. Okay, what if you have the clever idea? You see all these content providers out there. They need a lot of capacity. What if you go to them and say, hey, I'm going to sell you a couple of fiber pairs in the system. I'm not even going to sell it to you at profit. I'm going to do it at cost. You just take off some CapEx from me and help defray OpEx going forward. And let's say you manage to sell 2 fiber pairs or offload 2 fiber pairs that way. Well, your net cash flow is looking much better now. You actually break even, but that's still probably not enough to convince investors. All right, so you go back out and you sell 4 out of your 6. Now it's looking much better. And really on routes where content providers are large and prices are low, I don't really see any other way of building a cable besides this. And if you're trying to build a cable the old-fashioned way, which is to build all the transport yourself and hold it and sell it off as lit services over time, you're doing it the wrong way. What does this mean for prices? Well, essentially, the participation of content providers is defraying costs for everyone else, and it allows the owner of those remaining 2 fiber pairs of the cable to offer more aggressive price declines if it needs to. It could offer 25% compounded annual declines over time through its entire period and break even. Whereas if it didn't offload any fiber pairs, it could only do 18%. Now, it doesn't seem like a big difference in any given year, but over time it makes a huge difference for us. But there are negatives as well. And this last slide, it simply reviews what we've talked about in order. First, we talked about there's been a lot of unanticipated growth in international transport brought on by content providers. Overall, I would argue that is definitely a good. Negative is that that growth is not ubiquitous. It's concentrated on just a few routes worldwide. Another negative is that we're not really certain long-term what the future demand will be. My hunch is that it's still going to be very strong, but can't guarantee it. Positive is that content provider participation in cables brings on lower unit costs. That's great for the sellers. And for us, it's passed on as probably as lower prices. That's great. And the fact is there are some cables out there that simply would not exist if it weren't for the participation of content providers. Another good. But because there are only a few of these really big guys, Googles and Facebooks and Microsofts and so forth, there's a really significant market power shift in transport to buyers. That's probably a negative if you're a seller. And finally, this is more a topic for a future presentation, worthy of further research. But we may be at some point in the future, when we're going to be seeing content-only cables. What would that mean? That brings me to the final illusion, and this is a simple one to explain. We have to be careful what we desire. because sometimes our desires create mirages. And it's not just humans that this happens to. We've all been there. Thanks very much.